I'm sure you've heard this story that in 2010, someone paid 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas, and today they are worth over $500 million, those same Bitcoins. So those are very expensive pizzas. And what you're probably asking yourself is, where is this thing going? Is cryptocurrency going to change my life or change the world? Maybe even end the nation state as it is? In wartime, it's very clear how fragile human civilization is, and in fact, what is of value, right, to people, because banks, they can either have their money stolen by their home country because they need it for war, or by an invading country. In World War II, the most fascinating stories took place when England and France shipped their gold to the United States for safekeeping. So over time, there's a lot to think about in terms of how we got here and where we're going, especially in this case related to cryptocurrency. A long time ago, there were shells and salt and various things that people bartered with in exchange for goods and services. But these things, they usually required some proof of work that someone had found and extracted and standardized something like a gold coin, something like a bar of gold. And these things, they tend to survive. We have examples of gold coins and paper currency already from 1,000, 3,000 years ago in the case of China. One thing about gold to be aware of is that it's rare, it's beautiful, it's not poisonous or radioactive or corrosive. So there are certain characteristics that make some things more valuable than others. Now, after World War II, the Allied powers tried to create some level of stability in the world, and they created a system based on this little town in New Hampshire, in a place called Bretton Woods. And basically what happened is the dollar was pegged to the price of gold, and foreign currencies were pegged to the US dollar. The US dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency. And what this means is that it is held in a kind of risk management by other countries. They hold on to it because, again, it's stable and it provides a source of stored value in a medium of exchange that maybe their currency wouldn't have. If you were a small country who might get run over by a bigger country, for example, or you didn't have access to the enormous supply of gold that the United States does. So money, it's really important when we think about cryptocurrency to think about what makes for money. And it really is a human construct. It's based on economic consensus. It's a social convention. There's some kind of standardized shape, size, weight. So there's something called legal tender, which under a certain rule of law, merchants are required to accept it. So at a coffee shop, when the barista, before they make your coffee, they don't have to take your money. But after they make your coffee, they do. They're required by law to take your money for it. So it's something that can be exchanged for goods, services, and then governments are required to accept it as taxes. Good money is scarce, authentic, durable, portable, stable. In digital currency, if it is to survive and to thrive and to reach its potential, should have the exact same traits. Now, money leads to power. So the US, it has the trust of other countries who give the United States their money. They buy US Treasury securities because they're considered safe. And this is what we mean by a reserve currency, right? Other countries, they put their trust and their money into the United States. But it does lead to benefits of different sorts for each party. So so for those who are investing, again, there's stability. They're seeking to avoid devaluation. They're seeking to counter inflation. And what they get in the United States dollar is a managed supply. They get access to liquidity, access to markets, and they're buying into a system of trust. Monetary policy, when you hear that word on the evening news, what it's referring to is a government that is trying to further these concepts, right? The United States wants people to trust in the dollar, so they'll use it. Now, on the US side, there are certain advantages to having everybody give you their money. You can only imagine if this were the case, you know, in your house in the neighborhood, right? If you had that same privilege, and what some other countries call this an exorbitant privilege. It allows the United States to monetize its debt or to run balance of payments deficits. What this means is we can be a little more carefree in our spending, and we have the bandwidth to pursue policy objectives that other countries can't. So money, again, in this case, can equal power because the United States, you might know, has the most military assets by far, right? So some nations are not going to be happy with this and to seek changes, but nothing lasts forever. Right. So in the United States, we had the New Deal, social programs, the Vietnam War. All of these kind of put a strain on our ability to manage this Bretton Woods system. And by 1971, the United States was forced to end the convertibility of the dollar to gold, float its currency against worldwide currencies, and declare that the US dollar is a fiat currency. And what that means is it's backed by nothing else other than trust. Right? There's no gold behind the US dollar. It's only your belief in the current system. So let's look at the things that digital currency will have to achieve in order to succeed. And there's three essential elements of money. The first is called medium of exchange. Basically, that means that it needs to be an intermediary token of a certain value that can be traded for goods or services. And the benefit of a medium of exchange, like a dollar, is that it avoids what economists call the inconvenience of coincidence of wants. In other words, you may not want my apple, and I may not want your banana, right? But if that's all we've got, then we're stuck. But if we find an intermediary token to exchange, then many more options become available. There's a very famous story in Kenya, near where I'm currently living in Mozambique. And what happened there was that people began to have access to cell phones and airtime. So they started to trade airtime as currency. And what this did was lead to a major international corporation called M-Pesa that we use. For example, we just gave our gardener some money, and they were able to transfer it via M-Pesa to the north of Mozambique. And it all started with the transfer of air minutes as a medium of exchange. The next thing is called unit of account. And this is sort of a stable measure that can be used in multiples of the same unit to calculate costs, prices, profits, and performance, right? And the same thing, people want to be able to measure the trade and purchase and sale of goods and services. One very important element is called double entry bookkeeping. So it's keeping on the credit side and the debit side the same number, right? And this lies at the very heart of capitalism. And when people began to figure out double entry bookkeeping, it really helped Europe, for example, to emerge from the Dark Ages, specifically in Italy in the 1300s. So another important concept here to mention is that of a ledger, right? So it's a record of economic activity and financial relationships. And ledgers are so important, in fact, they may be even older than writing for communication. We have found bones in Africa that have a kind of correspondence ledger that is over 20,000 years old. A good ledger is kind of like good money, but it has slightly different characteristics. It should be immutable, unchangeable. This is a very important aspect of Bitcoin that we'll see soon. Time-stamped, same thing. Show ownership and be accurate, right? And so it's all about having a payment system, a way to amend ledgers that basically is, if you think about it, when you go to buy your morning coffee, right, your ledger gets deducted and the coffee shop's ledger gets added to. So store of value, this is the most difficult aspect for a cryptocurrency to achieve because of its volatility and the lack of basically central management. But those are benefits, of course, in other ways for crypto. But in a store of value, you're talking about a durable asset that has stable demand and saved purchasing power. So, for example, Russia today is buying a lot of gold because of its inherent properties that make it valuable, right? So these things, they tend to, you can use them for risk management. They can counter inflation or the fear of inflation. The US dollar has been very, very successful as a store of value, and that's one reason why it's been around for a while as a reserve currency. In fact, it's been so valuable that numerous countries, some, for example, Cambodia, Ecuador, Lebanon, Somalia, Zimbabwe, they have officially adopted the US dollar because their own currencies were too volatile, right? You can't pay $100 billion for dinner. In fact, that happened in many countries. So what they did was they just switched to the US dollar. Let's talk for a second just a little bit about the options that would be available because we want to know whether cryptocurrency could replace the US dollar. So currently in Russia, Vladimir Putin is thinking, how can I have a strategy to de-dollarize my economy, lower our vulnerability to US sanctions, and make Russia more independent. So they are currently the biggest state buyer of gold. In January 2021, the amount of gold just recently passed dollars, 23% to 22% in terms of the reserve in quantity in Russia, right? About cryptocurrency, some authoritarian governments are hesitant, right? Because part of the beauty for the owner of cryptocurrency is independence, right? Transnational, personal power. And of course, dictators don't really like that. And so in Russia, there have been a lot of legislation to stifle miners and ban cryptocurrency. But anyway, I just wanted you to think about an alternative to the dollar that may not be cryptocurrency that's out there. Here's a picture of Shanghai. So you can see in China, they have gone a little bit in a different direction, or in investing more in cryptocurrency already than Russia. Modern IT, if you think about it, is so powerful, right? Ethernet 1974, TCP/IP 1974, HTTP 1990, SSL TLS 96, and now Bitcoin 2009. These are programmable, right? Network protocols that can do amazing things in the mind, not only of a programmer, but potentially a revolutionary in terms of political and digital thought. So part of the challenge with cryptocurrency is how to move value across a decentralized network, peer-to-peer, with no trusted intermediary, again, no double counting, and that chips away at what's called the cost of trust, and something that would change the economics of verification. Who are you, and have I received my payment? And in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto, in a paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, revealed not only Bitcoin, but blockchain, right? That combines asymmetric cryptography, PKI, hash functions for integrity and tamper resistance, digital signatures for consent, append-only time-stamped blocks, and much else, right? These are the kinds of things that literally can be used to secure the entire internet, right? What you want are verifiable, immutable transactions. And one of the things that Bitcoin and blockchain have claimed to have solved is something called the Byzantine generals problem, which is how do you get all of your military elements working together? It does require a lot of trust, right? Because just before the attack, a lot of units want to go quiet so they don't give away their positions, etc. But then how do you know that everybody is doing what they're supposed to do? So if you look that up, the Byzantine generals problem, this is one historic challenge that Satoshi Nakamoto has claimed to have solved. Today, there's over 1,000 cryptocurrencies, which shows its promise. And also numerous initial coin offerings. And in China, again, most payments, about 80% today, are already digital payments. And even, in fact, in the United States, you're using your card a lot more than dollars. But one test will be in 2022, the Beijing Winter Olympics, where they will test cryptocurrency. Okay, just a word on blockchain, because it's sort of the foundation that makes all of this happen, right? And if you go back to the ledger discussion, which is so key to a modern economy, basically, a cryptocurrency is a digital asset, kind of like the app, that is decentralized and used among humans. But blockchain is the ledger technology, right? It's an auditable database that is public, and the records can be looked up. It's a list of records that are, these blocks are tied together with cryptography. They're time-stamped. They're append only, which means that it's kind of like a house of cards. If you were to go back and change one of the blocks, then the whole thing would fall apart, right? So that the math is designed as kind of a one-way math that when something happens on the blockchain, it stays there forever, right? So from a human perspective, it is a communication protocol that is based on consensus, right? So it's public, it's secure. It creates additional coins through mining, and it verifies coin ownership. There are a lot of technical aspects to the input and output of the blocks, but basically, for the purposes of this talk, it's just important to know that they are tied together in important ways. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, CISO at VGS, to talk a little bit more about mining. Cryptocurrency mining.
Great. Thank you, Kenneth. And that was a really awesome intro to currency. And, the topic of this talk is whether cryptocurrency can displace the dollar, right? So what are some of the operational aspects of cryptocurrency that is going on? So let's talk about mining a bit more. So if you're someone who wants to get access to Bitcoins, for example, there's two ways to do that. You can either mine it or you can purchase Bitcoin, right? Or acquire it. Well, acquiring it is not cheap, right? The current market rate of Bitcoin is over 50,000 right now per Bitcoin. So let's specifically use Bitcoin mining as an example here, because Bitcoin is the most popular of all of the different options for cryptocurrency. So right now at over 50K per Bitcoin, perhaps mining is a more desired approach for some people. So let's talk about how mining works and what actions are Bitcoin miners taking. So what essentially miners are doing is they're trying to be the first to come up with a solution to a puzzle, like a hashing puzzle, right? So the probability of being the first to discover the solution is proportional to the amount of mining or computing power the miner has on the network. That's what it is, right? This process used to be easier back when Bitcoin mining started, but has increased fairly exponentially in difficulty as more entities have caught on to Bitcoin mining, and there's more and more units out there or miners out there. So if you think about it from a hardware setup standpoint, I have a background in hardware engineering, so love to think about this kind of problem. Miners need to have access to graphics processing units or GPUs, for example, to set up mining operations. There are now entire mining farms that exist to conduct Bitcoin mining. So in fact, the picture that you see on this slide is a mining farm in Iceland, of all places, right? Very remote places where property and all of this setup can be done fairly easily. So going back to what I said earlier about being the first to solve the solution to a hashing puzzle, why are they doing that, right? So miners are doing this because they're effectively conducting auditing to verify the legitimacy of the Bitcoin transactions. This is actually pretty clever, that this is the reason why they're solving these puzzles, and then there's a whole reason for that. This auditing minimizes the risk that Bitcoin holders could make a copy of the digital token and spend the same Bitcoin twice, for example. You wouldn't want that. If you have an actual physical dollar, you spend it, it goes into the hands of someone else. You can't then respend it, right? But like with digital tokens, it's not quite that straightforward as physical money. So this is a mechanism by which that risk is minimized. So in this way, miners work to verify, for example, one meg worth or a block of Bitcoin transactions. So at that point, when they verified this block, the miner is eligible, but not necessarily going to be rewarded with a certain quantity of Bitcoin. But to actually get rewarded or get paid, the miner needs to be the first one to come up with the exact or close 64-digit hexadecimal number or the hash that is less than or equal to the target hash. So this means that only miners that are able to generate high hash rates, and when I say high, we're talking like terahashes per second, have a good chance to succeed to actually get paid for this. So it is not easy to get paid for mining. So what does that mean for resourceful miners, the ones that are actually getting paid? They're probably joining mining pools to pool resources, right? And some of them are also looking to take advantage of potentially free resources out there. For example, both GitLab and GitHub offer free CI minutes to a certain extent. So what miners might do is they might create a whole bunch of free accounts on these infrastructures owned by GitLab or GitHub. And the miner would get access to a good deal of computing power, right? All at the expense of either GitLab or GitHub. So of course, this is considered to be against the terms of service or terms of use for this, for GitLab or GitHub, and is considered to be abuse activity. And then it becomes imperative for the company like GitLab or GitHub to figure out how to detect this type of crypto mining activity and block the activity so that they don't have to pay for that usage. Detecting and blocking crypto mining activity, just like any detection work, is very much an arms race. Detecting indicators of crypto mining activity can include conducting analysis of DNS traffic or monitoring for specific strings or patterns in network packets, or potentially monitoring IRC communications in the network. But keep in mind that as you're developing algorithms to monitor and detect and then subsequently block this type of activity on the infrastructure, the miners are also reacting to that blocking activity and maybe upping the ante, right, on how to avoid being detected next time. So what you see is a lot of what we call low and slow type of activity, where it probably will not easily spike utilization of your resources because that would just be way too easy to discover, right? So this is what I mean by this is very much an arms race because it's not easy to deal with. So what we've done before was maybe use machine learning based heuristics to process a lot of data and look for outlier behavior, which helps with the low and slow types as well. But this is not easy to implement, of course. So we've all heard the term cryptojacking before, but exactly what does this mean, right? So miners are very resourceful. They're very financially motivated. And some of them are targeting, attacking, and compromising internet-facing computers to gain control of large numbers of resources to conduct mining activities. So, for example, one of the most publicized crypto mining malware includes WannaMine. So miners are very resourceful. They're doing a number of things to try to either get free resources or pull together to actually get paid for their transactions. And now we move to what are the benefits here of cryptocurrency? And Kenneth will take that.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So I just want to mention briefly that at the individual level, as well as at the national level, there are truly revolutionary aspects about cryptocurrency, right? If it's really decentralized and transnational, just think about the personal potential, and even for at the nation state level, developing nations to have an alternate way to invest and to save, right? Other than, let's say, being dependent on the U.S. dollar. But at the individual level, there are ownership issues that are so important, not only in terms of potentially ROI, but access to credit, the ability to exchange assets. We've seen with NFTs recently in the news over the past few days. So it applies to the poor person as well as the rich person. A poor person wants some access, but even rich investors sense the market cap, the spreads that they seek in terms of investment, and even shifting risk to certain parties where they haven't been able to in the past. All of this leads to political potential that could, in fact, slow down acceptance and use and adoption of cryptocurrency. Because, for example, I have a lot of experience in Estonia, where I used to live, and they have put more of their government services and digital society online than any other country. And they claim that it's specifically, in many cases, meant to diminish corruption, right? By publishing more of taxes, more of budgets, more of salaries. And one of the questions is do governments actually want to be less corrupt? And that's a political question for voters and for governments. But more transparency could lead us in that direction. But I'm excited about all of these things. Really, what I want to emphasize is that these political impacts may, in fact, slow down adoption, because governments, in their desire to get their mind around this issue, will create policy obstacles to adoption. On the risk side, there's just a lot to think about as well. And I'll mention, for example, lost hardware and lost passwords. You've probably all seen this in the news, and it's not an isolated case, but there's one person who's been in the New York Times recently who has over $500 million in Bitcoin, but has forgotten his password, right? And so if you could sum all of the risks up into that, for example, how many times have you lost a phone or upgraded a phone, and then you can't remember the password when you pull it out of a drawer the next year? So there's a lot. And on the criminal side, one of the things is weak know your client, right? So Bitcoin exchanges, for example, that are high risk, they might be dealing in criminal activity or even terrorist activity that governments are wary of, right? So central banks, one of the things they want to do is protect investors and protect citizens, right, from scams and from, because governments like stability, right, depending on which government, of course, but most sitting governments want to stay in power, and so they do tend to err toward stability. So anyway, there's a lot to think about here, including, if you're a small player or potentially a government, right, even losing some of your authority, right? So I think you will find governments hesitant to let go of the dollar in this case, or let go of their authority in a bigger sense. So let me pass it back to Kathy to talk about security in this space.
Yeah, thank you. So how many of you have had people ask you about what's the security of, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, like, as if it's a brand new problem, right? But if you think about the security pillars of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, all of that does apply to cryptocurrency as well. So what are the security implications for cryptocurrency? I think the place that we should look at as being sort of the holy grail or the vault of where access is probably successful access is best is with the crypto wallet, right? That's where all of the private keys are stored. And if you get access to a crypto wallet, then you effectively own the currency. So can attackers steal that wallet? We have to think about it from that perspective. Absolutely, they can, right? Did you ever hear of ElectroRat malware, for example? So the RAT part stands for Remote Access Tool, and ElectroRat was thought to have been released maybe over a year ago and has been targeting users via cryptocurrency and blockchain-related online forums. This was actually almost like a marketing campaign where there were ads and there were posts that enticed users to actually click on downloading a particular app to help them, get more Bitcoin. But then once they install the app, then it's actually a malicious app that is quite intrusive, right? And it conducts activities such as key logging, exfilling files, executing commands on the target system. And this malware worked for multiple OSs, including Windows, Linux, Mac OS. But what was remarkable about this particular malware was that it was written from scratch. The attacker actually wrote this whole thing from scratch, created this whole campaign around the distribution of it. And it was able to evade signature-based malware detection capabilities for quite some time because it was written from scratch, right? There wasn't like some sort of pre-canned type of malware module that it used that made it easier to detect by signature-based systems. So this is actually pretty remarkable, and I anticipate that more of these will be rolling out as the value of Bitcoin increases. But cryptocurrency wallets, they hold private keys, as I said, and the pillars of security still apply, just like any other sensitive data that needs to be protected from unauthorized access, unauthorized modifications, and inaccessibility, right? So thinking about it like a little bit ahead of where things are right now, a lot of you may be familiar with the zero trust principle. And what is zero trust? Zero trust is the principle or the model of tying in the user, a device, and the type of data that is being accessed. So can this type of model or principle be applied to further secure the SaaS-based crypto wallets, for example? Of course it can, right? Because a lot of the same principles still apply with sensitive data. For example, access to the wallet could be restricted to only a specific user utilizing a specific device in order to access the wallet. And maybe just also enable a multi-factor authentication scheme so that the access process is further secured or tightened as well. So these are ideas that are kind of floating around the community in terms of how to secure crypto wallets, but that has to be the number one target by attackers just because of what it is.
So we're going to wrap up now, just in the next 2 slides, and say there is no doubt that cryptocurrency is a game changer. Blockchain, I'm sure you've heard, could be as big as the internet itself, right? The price of Bitcoin speaks for itself. The vast potential awaits, right, in this space. That said, to answer our question for this talk in particular, in the near term, cryptocurrency cannot be a replacement for the US dollar, due in particular to its security, its volatility. But if you put it in conceptual terms, it's trust, right? It's speed. Visa right now can do about 70,000 transactions a second. By comparison, Bitcoin is doing a handful. So it will take time. Over the long term, there will be plenty of interest in cryptocurrency. But public adoption, remember the airtime anecdote from Kenya, it will become a societal norm, but it will take time. The security risks have to be better understood and addressed. The speed in the payment system needs to be faster. But in fact, the same thing happens with every technology. So credit cards in the 1950s, it took about 15 to 20 years for Congress to enact laws that understood and managed all of the issues surrounding credit cards. So just keep your eyes peeled in this space. But financial firms will be one bellwether to watch. What are they doing? How are they absorbing this into their traditional systems? Now, I want to, on this last slide, if you choose to buy, right, if you choose to opt for cryptocurrency over dollars in this case, we want to have a disclaimer and says we're not investment advisors. We're information security researchers. However, we have found some pretty interesting advice, such as the 3 key elements of investment I came across, which is consistency, tax planning, and emotional control, right? So you don't want to be a minimalist or a maximalist in this case, but just think about it rationally. Have a plan. Is your goal wealth preservation or wealth creation? How much bandwidth do you have? Right? Because let's face it, Bitcoin might be the most valuable asset in human history, or via some kind of policy or trust failure might drop to zero, right? So Elon Musk can afford to lose his Bitcoins, but you and I are not in the same position, right? That said, there's plenty of space for growth in fintech. There's a lot of economic rent in the system that fintech is finding it can improve in terms of efficiency and speed, space, access, scale. Remember that most of the world is still unbanked, right? So part of the goal of many fintech companies is to figure out how to offer credit and services to much of the world, which has not had access to traditional banking. So we'll leave it there and just say that it's best to have a logical plan for you and to revisit it regularly. Many, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.